can you retire with $850,000? Or will helping your adult kids cost you retirement? This is a survey that's been making the rounds lately, an Allianz poll, recent, nationally representative, and it found that nearly 70% of Americans say they're more afraid of running out of money in retirement than they are of dying, not outliving their purpose, not losing their health, not being forgotten, running out of money. And I think most of us, if we're honest, don't find that surprising at all, because we've felt it, that low-level hum of financial uncertainty that doesn't ever fully go quiet. Not when the market dips, not when a kid needs help, not when you look at your statement and think, is this actually going to hold? Today, we're going to talk about $850,000. For a lot of people, that number represents a life's work. Decades of saving, staying disciplined, watching the account grow slowly the way these things do. And if you're sitting somewhere close to that number right now, there's probably a part of you that feels like you've made it to a relatively safe place. But here's the thing, whether $850,000 is actually enough depends almost entirely on what you're doing with it, and more specifically, on a few quiet habits that can drain it in ways that don't show up on any budget spreadsheet. One of those habits is something that 75% of American parents are doing right now, and most of them don't fully see it as a risk. We'll get there, but let's start with the math, because the math is the foundation. At today's safe withdrawal rate, and I want to be specific here, because this number changed this year, Morningstar puts the 2026 safe withdrawal rate at 3.9%. That's up slightly from 3.7% last year, but it's still below the 4% rule most people were told to plan around. What does 3.9% of $850,000 actually look like? It's $33,150 a year, not $57,000, not $65,000, $33,150. Now, I want to pause on that for a second, because a lot of people hear that number and think, well, I'll have Social Security on top of that. And yes, that's true. The average Social Security benefit for a retired couple right now is roughly $30,800 a month, which is about $45,600 a year. That's meaningful. For many households, that combination, portfolio withdrawals plus Social Security, does push things into workable territory. But the average American retired household spends $57,818 a year. That's not a lavish number. That's housing, food, utilities, transportation, the occasional trip somewhere warm in February. That's just living. And if you're withdrawing $33,150 from your nest egg and collecting somewhere around that Social Security average, you're right at the edge, not comfortably clear of it. At the edge, there's something else worth knowing about that 4% rule. The original version, the one that's been quoted in retirement planning conversations for 30 years. The man who created it now says it's outdated. He says portfolios may need to last longer than 30 years, especially if you retire early. And that means the number you actually need in savings isn't necessarily $850,000. It might be meaningfully higher depending on when you stop working and how long you live. I'm not telling you this to alarm you. I'm telling you this because a lot of people are walking into retirement with assumptions that were formed years ago, and the ground has shifted a little. So let's talk about where the money actually goes. Because the average spending figure hides something important. When people budget for retirement, they think about housing, food, the car, maybe travel. What they usually don't build in as a real concrete number is healthcare. Fidelity puts the lifetime out-of-pocket healthcare cost for a couple retiring at 65 at $345,000. That's their 2025 estimate. And what makes that number genuinely difficult is that it's not included in the average spending figures we talk about. It's separate. It's on top. Think about what that means for an $850,000 nest egg. If healthcare costs end up consuming $345,000 of that over the course of retirement, and they very well might, you're looking at 40% of your savings gone before you're 80 just to stay healthy, before groceries, before property taxes, before helping anyone. Most retirees don't think about healthcare as a lump sum. They think about it as a monthly bill, something that gets paid and refilled, but it compounds, it grows. And if you haven't set aside a dedicated piece of your portfolio for it, you're effectively withdrawing from the same pot for everything. The vacation, the prescription, the copay, the kid's emergency. And that brings me to the part of this conversation I think matters most. 75% of American parents are currently providing financial support to their adult children. That comes from an ARP survey, 2025, nationally representative, nearly 1,800 respondents. The average annual support is $7,000. The median is considerably lower, around $1,400, which tells you that a smaller number of parents are carrying a heavier load. But the majority, 3 out of 4, are sending money in some direction to grown kids. And I want to be careful here because this isn't a judgment. These aren't irresponsible people making bad decisions. 42% of them say they do it simply because they want to, not because anyone asked, not because there was an emergency. They do it because that's what parents do. That's how they've always understood their role. But let's run the actual math. If your portfolio generates $33,150 a year, and you're sending $7,000 of that to an adult child, or splitting it across a few of them, you're left with $26,150 from your investments, before Social Security, before health care. And you're still living in a world where average annual spending is nearly $58,000. The gap doesn't close cleanly, it compresses. And it compresses quietly, without drama, because $7,000 doesn't feel like a retirement-ending number. It feels like helping. It feels like what a good parent does. Here's what makes this harder. 53% of the adult children receiving that support could actually meet their own basic needs without it. They're not in genuine crisis. They're receiving help that was never quite necessary. And the parent is carrying the cost without ever fully accounting for it. 42% of these parents report financial stress from the support. 35% report emotional stress, but 92% say their relationships with those same kids are close, meaningful, good. The support isn't transactional. It's love expressed in the most practical way a parent knows how, which is exactly why it's so hard to stop. Think about what this looks like over 10 or 15 years. Same person, same $850,000 starting point, same adult kids. One scenario, they send $7,000 a year, every year, without a plan or a conversation about when it ends. The first 5 years go fine, because the market cooperates, but they're also in their early retirement years, so they're spending a little extra on travel, on experiences they've been putting off for decades. Maybe $62,000 a year total instead of $57,000. It feels fine. It's earned. By year 10, the nest egg has dropped significantly more than projected, and they're starting to notice. The other scenario, they have a conversation. They set a limit, maybe $2,000 a year, maybe nothing in cash, but they cover a grandchild's school supplies. They help with a specific expense. They spend intentionally in those first 5 years instead of instinctively. They protect the base. By year 10, they're in a different position. Not rich, not worry-free, but stable. Morningstar's research found that retirees who retire at 65 face about a 45% chance of exhausting their savings. That drops to 28%, nearly cut in half for people who wait until 70. And both of those numbers get worse when there's a consistent, unplanned outflow to a third party. The math isn't cruel. It's just honest. There's something that happens in the first 5 years of retirement that doesn't get talked about enough. People overspend dramatically, often, and it's not because they're reckless. It's because those first years are when they feel best. The energy is still there. The knees still work. There are places they've wanted to go for 20 years, and now they finally have the time. So they go, and they spend. And there's nothing wrong with that in principle. But spending drops by somewhere between 19 and 34% by the time most people reach their 80s. The body slows down. The appetite for big trips fades. The daily cost of living actually becomes more manageable, except for healthcare, which does the opposite. The problem is that if you burned through your spending cushion in years 1 through 5, the math gets uncomfortable in years 15 through 20. You've traded future flexibility for early joy, which feels like a reasonable trade until it isn't. On $850,000 with adult children to support and healthcare costs that aren't built into your budget. The early year overspending pattern is the thing that quietly accelerates the risk, not any single thing. The combination, I want to shift something here, because I think there's a framing problem in how we talk about this. The framing is usually, stop helping your kids so much, you're hurting yourself. And that framing doesn't work. It doesn't land, because it makes parents feel like they're being asked to choose between love and math. And most people, most good people, will choose love every single time. But that's not actually the choice. The real question is, what kind of help serves them? Parents who provide open-ended, unstructured financial support without a conversation about expectations and duration. They often end up with adult children who are less equipped to stand on their own, not more. The help that feels generous in the moment sometimes delays the development it was meant to support. And there's a version of this story that plays out 15 or 20 years down the road, when the parent is 82 and the nest egg is genuinely depleted, and now the adult child, who is 55, with their own retirement to worry about, has to step in. That's a heavier burden than any parent would have chosen to place. Protecting your own retirement isn't a selfish act. It's arguably the most financially responsible thing you can do for your family, because the alternative, becoming dependent on the people you were trying to help, costs everyone more in every way. This is the part of the conversation most families never have, not because they don't care, because it's uncomfortable, because it means saying, I love you and I can't do this indefinitely, and we need to talk about what that looks like. That conversation is hard. It's much harder than writing a check, but the families who have it early are in a different position 5 years later than the ones who don't. Fear is real in this. I want to say that plainly, because I think it gets minimized. 28% of workers say they expect to delay retirement specifically because they're afraid their money won't last. And that fear isn't irrational. We've established that $850,000 at today's withdrawal rates produces income that falls short of average spending. Before healthcare, before helping anyone, the math supports the anxiety. But fear-based decisions without a clear plan don't actually solve anything. They just postpone the reckoning. Working until 70, when you could have retired at 65, is a meaningful choice, but only if it comes with a real plan for what those extra years of saving actually change. Otherwise, you're just moving the worry forward in time, arriving at 70 with more money and the exact same unresolved questions. 22% of retirees say their biggest financial regret is not saving enough, early enough. That's the most common answer in most surveys on this topic. The second most common, not having a plan, not bad investments, not a market crash, not healthcare costs they didn't see coming, not having a plan, which is a remarkably preventable regret. So what does a plan actually look like on $850,000? I'm not going to give you a 10-step framework. That's not what this is. But there are a few honest pressure points worth naming. The first one is the child support conversation. If you're currently providing financial support to adult children, even at a modest level, it needs to have a structure, an amount, a timeline, an understanding on both sides of what it's for and when it ends. That's not a rejection. It's a relationship. And most adult children, when they understand what they're actually asking of their parents' retirement, want to adjust. They don't want to be the reason their parent runs short at 80. The second pressure point is healthcare. It needs to come out of its own bucket, mentally if not literally. If you're thinking of your $850,000 as one undifferentiated pool of retirement money, you're almost certainly underestimating what healthcare will consume. Treating it as a separate, dedicated reserve changes how you make decisions from everything else. The third pressure point is the early years. If you retire at 65 feeling healthy and energetic, which is exactly how you should feel, the temptation to spend freely is powerful and understandable. But a modest early year spending discipline buys you significant flexibility later. Not austerity, just intentionality. Knowing the difference between a trip you've genuinely planned for and a trip that feels fine because the account balance looks okay right now. None of these are dramatic interventions. They're conversations and decisions most people have been avoiding, usually because avoiding them is easier than having them. I want to say something about identity, because I think it sits underneath all of this in a way that doesn't get acknowledged. For a lot of people in their 60s, men especially, though not exclusively, being the provider is wrapped up in who they understand themselves to be. It's not just a role, it's an identity. It's the thread that runs through 30 years of work and sacrifice and showing up. Retirement already asks you to let go of the worker identity. That's a real loss, even when retirement is wanted and earned. And then, on top of that, someone is asking you to pull back as the financial provider for your family. That's a lot of identity to renegotiate at once. I think that's why these conversations are so hard. It's not really about the money. It's about who you are when the money stops flowing. It's about whether you still matter to the people who depend on you. It's about the fear, quieter than the financial fear, but just as real, that pulling back the support changes something in the relationship, that your kids will see you differently, that you'll see yourself differently. 9 out of 10 parents in one study said they'd make additional sacrifices for their adult children if asked. And most of them meant it without reservation. That's not a financial instinct. That's a parental one. And financial planning that doesn't account for it isn't really planning for the person. It's planning for an abstraction. The honest truth is that protecting your retirement and protecting your relationships are not opposites. They just require a different kind of conversation than the one most families have been having. Here's where I want to land. $850,000 can work. It's not a comfortable number, not in 2026, not at today's withdrawal rates, not with healthcare costs where they are. But it can work. Plenty of people are making it work. The difference between the ones who do and the ones who don't isn't usually the size of the nest egg. It's whether they've identified the quiet drains and addressed them honestly. The adult child support, the unbudgeted healthcare, the early year overspending. Any one of these is manageable on its own. All three together, unexamined and unplanned, is what turns a reasonable retirement into a precarious one. If you've been putting off a conversation about what financial support to your kids looks like going forward, what the amount is, what the timeline is, what the expectation is on both sides, that conversation is probably worth having sooner than later, not to cut people off, not to choose your retirement over your family, but to give your retirement a real chance so that 20 years from now you're not the problem your family has to solve. Most viewers, I'd guess, know exactly which conversation they've been putting off. It's not that they don't see it, it's that seeing it and having it are two very different things. This video was just trying to make the shape of it a little clearer. Drop a comment if something here landed for you, or if there's a question you're sitting with that you haven't quite figured out how to ask. You're probably not the only one asking it. We'll be back with more.